When my wife and I first got married, we were super lucky to be able to take a trip on our honeymoon to Europe, which was significant not just because we were newlyweds, but also because we were fairly new Catholics. And we're in that phase where everything was new and exciting, especially about our faith. But what was also new was the experience of being slandered and lied about as Catholics, which we weren't spared from on our visit, because at one point we stopped in Pisa in Italy to see the Leaning Tower, the famous Leaning Tower, and also the Cathedral, which was right next to it. And as we were touring the cathedral, we were in a group led by a local tour guide who at one point stopped to explain to us that when the cathedral was built, the church taught that women don't have souls, to which I was so dumbfounded by. I didn't even have the composure to offer any kind of correction or anything. I couldn't even process it until after the tour was over, and then it sunk in that he was just making stuff up like this and getting paid to do it. And if it weren't for the fact that the Catholic Church had made such beautiful destinations for tourists to come see, he wouldn't have a job in the first place. And maybe most dumbfounding and unbelievable of all is the fact that the cathedral is named after the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary and is full of art depicting her glorious Assumption, the same woman we refer to as the Mother of God, and happens to be the preeminent saint in our canon of saints, who clearly must have a soul. He stood in that place and had the audacity to make the claim that was so vividly contradicted by not just a 2-second Google search, which anybody could have done, but by the name on the building we were standing in and all the artwork that we were surrounded by that communicates the exact opposite truth. And yet everyone in the tour went, "Oh, that's terrible. Why would they teach things like that?" Which left me wondering, why would he say such a thing? Did he believe it? If not, what purpose does it serve to invent such an egregious lie? Whether he was the source of it or not, someone composed that lie, and it eventually found its way to our tour group and probably countless other tour groups just like us. And it was one of the first experiences that I had as a Catholic of finding myself on the receiving end of the calumny of the world, who clearly hates the church in certain measures and will stop at nothing to denounce her. And when they find themselves short of legitimate criticisms, they'll just make stuff up. But we probably can speculate why a lie like that would be invented. It serves the purpose of framing our Christian past as a time in which women weren't just, second-class citizens. They were seen as subhuman. I mean, they didn't even have souls. And so they were completely subject to the dominance of men and institutions like the Catholic Church, who reinforce that state of affairs. And by contrast, it makes the modern, secular world, along with ideologies like feminism and egalitarianism, appear to be perfectly reasonable against the backdrop of such unreasonable alternatives. It's the same reason countries like England had to invent the Spanish Black Legend about the supposed millions of victims of the Spanish Inquisition. The more evil they could portray their Catholic rival, the more innocuous the cruelties and injustices of their own regime appeared, and the more they could celebrate and congratulate themselves for being so much better by comparison. But if you have to invent a slander of that scale in order to improve your own standing as an alternative, what does that actually say about you and your regime? Obviously, it's a confirmation of how clearly evil your own enterprise is, since it only appears sensible when compared to supposedly millions of dead victims that don't actually exist. And to add to that insecurity and lack of positive accolades, you can also add propaganda and slander to your list of accomplishments. For me, that whole episode introduced me to the tenuous insecurity of the modern liberal world's justification for its own dreadfully fallacious philosophical foundations and its record of unambiguous injustices. But it also shows how extreme feminism had become, as it had to resort to propaganda and slander to an unbelievably audacious degree in order to continue to convince us of its necessity. And it's a story, my story, that doesn't even begin to compare to the weight that I would say young men are growing up with today, because feminism began with the claim that men and women should have equal rights before the law, which, it doesn't sound all that unreasonable, especially in a democratic age of equality. But now it's become an incontrovertible establishment in which young men grow up learning from the moment they're able to begin their education that they are inherently problematic by virtue of their biology, that their very nature is to blame for the past oppressions of vulnerable demographics like women, and that they ought to live their lives in penance for their privileged status and embrace the process of having that same privilege revoked through measures to deny them opportunities like school admission and employment in order to, balance the scales of justice. And by balance the scales of justice, we mean that women make up a considerable majority of university graduates today, as they thrive in a system that is designed to cater to their strengths. And instead of appreciating the needs of young boys especially, we simply just medicate them for their restlessness. And so while society not only underappreciates men, it actively places a boot on their necks. They're expected to say thank you, while admitting that the only one being oppressed here is women, by the very same men who are refused access to essential opportunities for their future success. So, it's no wonder there's a growing resentment from young men who are stuck in an impossible place of denunciation from society, having all the cards stacked against them, and being told that they deserve it because of the biology that they were born with. And it's also no wonder there seems to be this growing resentment between the sexes, like the ability to pair off and have committed, fruitful relationships between men and women, something past generations took for granted, seems more out of reach than ever before. And then you compound that with a brutal and oppressive economic situation imposed by previous generations, especially with their voting habits. How could you not feel resentful and isolated? It must feel utterly futile to even bother trying to build towards a life in which you can even try to raise a family. And if you're a Christian, our susceptibility to resentment towards the opposite sex shouldn't be all that surprising, because we were told that this kind of rivalry and conflict of interest is a consequence of the fall of mankind right out of the Bible. God said to Eve, after they had been exposed for their betrayal, that your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you, which depicts a much more contentious relationship than what they had originally enjoyed in their paradisal condition. What we also know as Christians is that Christ is restoring what was lost in the fallen and making all things new, so that grace can heal that division. But as Christianity becomes increasingly irrelevant in Western society, I don't think it should surprise us that those old consequences of resentment and rivalry are becoming more pronounced again. But what I find more discouraging is when I see Christians falling prey to those same kinds of resentments. Because when we suffer under the effects of ideologies like feminism, it's easy to see the solution as a hard swing of the pendulum in the opposite direction to something like the misogynism of the old pagan world. Because the irony is that when compared to most civilizations, including much of the world today, historic and traditional Christianity introduces a lot more status and dignity for women than pagan society does or did. Like in the Greco-Roman world, in which Christianity first appeared, it was a common practice for infant girls to be left to die by exposure because they were seen as nothing more than dependents and liabilities. But Christianity uniquely opposed this practice and even put effort into rescuing abandoned infant girls. In Rome, women had no independent legal identity or status. After Christianity became the norm, those laws were softened and even abandoned by late antiquity. And believe it or not, it's also why the church took such a hard line against infanticide in general, and especially abortion, because it was often used by promiscuous and adulterous men to conceal their adultery. And so they would force the women that they impregnated to go and commit the unthinkable in their minds. So husbands were free to commit adultery, have mistresses, and divorce at will, and just abandon their dependents and wives who made all kinds of sacrifices for that marriage. But Christianity condemned adultery for men and women, and enforced the monogamous commitments of men to their wives. How about a practice like sati in Hindu cultures, in which the widow was expected to be burned alive when her husband, who has now been deceased, was cremated, in large part because it was seen that there was no purpose or provision for her life anymore. By contrast, Christ elevated widows as a distinct class of people who deserved our attention and especially our mercy. And they were also even given a unique ecclesial status and roles within the church. But if young men react to their bad treatment by a thoroughly feminist culture by pushing the pendulum too far in the other direction, they risk aligning themselves more with the ancient pagan world than they do with the ancient Christian world or the ancient church, which is something I think we're seeing a lot of in especially movements like the Groyper and the incel movements who seem inclined to simply denounce women for being women at times. And when I see this in young men who identify as Christian, I think they risk betraying their faith by overindulging in their resentments. If they're learning that men have headship over women in ecclesial and in the family life of the church, and this is like a red pill epiphany moment for them compared to what they've been taught by the secular culture or even within their own families, then that's great. That's great that they're learning about their history and their heritage and church teaching. But if that swings far wide into a kind of domination over women without the role of love as the supreme supernatural virtue modeled after Christ's self-sacrificial example, then I'd say we're missing the mark. And remember, it was Christ himself who elevated marriage to the significant status it has always had in the church. Prior to and outside of Christianity, marriage was simply a means for men to do as they please and get what they want in their future legacy. But Christianity introduced obligations and sacramental obligations for both men and women in order to teach us how to love one another. And when it's done according to the church's instruction and Christ's own design, it's an amazing thing. I love my wife so much, and she's been an incredible blessing to me that I wouldn't trade for anything. Not just because, I have headship over her or because she submits to me, but also because her love often challenges me to be a better man, which I want for myself. And she makes huge sacrifices in her life, which I can't help but be incredibly humbled by. For example, she's gone through 8 labors, 8 times delivering children. She homeschools our kids, and she tirelessly devotes herself to ensuring that they will be raised with the Catholic faith. Now, here's also where I'd like to lead this conversation, because when my amazing wife, who sacrifices so much, wants to listen to a podcast in the limited downtime she gets, the range of faithful Catholic material that's out there that's directed towards her vocation, her interests, is extremely limited. Faithful Catholic women who have time or energy to put into producing content like that are few and far between. So that when people like someone like Lila Rose appears, seemingly doing her best effort to try to talk about what it means to be a Catholic woman in today's world, that's something I'm actually grateful for. Which isn't to say that Lila Rose and other feminine-oriented podcasts aren't susceptible to criticism. I'm sure they are. To be honest, I don't actually know, because I don't really listen to her podcast or others like it, because I'm not the target audience. But let's assume there are valid criticisms of her content and others like her. Heck, there are plenty of valid criticisms of my content. And to the degree that those criticisms are accurate, I think they should be offered as a valid form of correction. But what I often see leveled against personalities like Lila Rose implies that her critics think she shouldn't be doing what she's doing simply because she's a woman, and because women should keep quiet, which I just don't sympathize with, because again, there should be content for women by women. My wife wasn't raised Catholic, and neither was I, and I don't think Lila Rose was either. We're all here trying to reinvent the wheel, as are probably most young people who are orphaned from their heritage, which means we need to communicate with each other about how it's going and how to do it, what works for some people and what might work for others, which is why I want my wife to be able to find podcasts and YouTube channels and books from other Catholic women who are doing their best to find the right balance, even if they get it wrong from time to time. It's simply not true that women can't play a pedagogical role in the life of the church. We have female doctors of the church, for crying out loud. In the same way our teachings in history rebuke that tour guide from Pisa, Italy, they rebuke people who think women should do nothing more than stay at home and keep their mouths shut in the church. Women have held important roles of authority throughout the church's life, which include teaching roles. So when people complain that women like Lila have no right to talk about challenges facing men and women today for a primarily female audience, at least that's my impression, I just don't buy into that principle. If she's saying things that are wrong, then that's where the focus of the complaint should be, and the focus of that correction, but not simply because she's a woman. It was women who first shared the news of the resurrection, and imagine if the apostles dismissed them on account of the fact that they were women. And according to St. Anselm of Canterbury, after the Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist, no one pleases the Lord more than St. Mary Magdalene. And of course, the Blessed Virgin Mary has always been held as a philosopher par excellence because of her example of contemplation. If you don't think she exercises authority, including teaching authority in the kingdom of God, you'd be critically mistaken. And likewise, women in the church do share in certain measures of authority, which includes roles as teachers. And if they didn't, then my kids would never have learned anything as homeschoolers. I know we live in an extreme and polarizing age, and there is need to push back against the currents of feminism. So it's tempting to react against one extreme by resorting to the opposite extreme. But Aristotle taught, and the church affirms, that virtue is found in the mean between extremes, between excess and defect. So the only appropriate reaction to the extremes of egalitarianism and feminism is by rediscovering the true and constant teachings of the church. And to whatever degree you feel the need to correct people like Lila Rose or any prominent figure in the church, it should be motivated by charity for your brother or your sister, with the aim of recovering them and helping them grow in understanding and fidelity to the church and to Christ. If it's simply motivated by anger and resentment and the satisfaction that such passions demand, then I'd say, log off and go find something more fruitful to do. So, no matter how bleak the decline of society could get, the one thing I'm always encouraged by is faith-filled families reproducing a generation who can turn the boat around. But that can't happen if Catholics aren't getting married and having those babies, which is easier said than done in today's world. I'm constantly hearing reports from young people who are saying how hard it is to find good matches with other faithful Catholics. And while there's no silver bullet solution to those challenges, I've had the chance to get to know the people at Catholic Match. And I can honestly recommend them as a company who is intentionally doing everything they can to create tools to help people move towards sacramental marriages. I personally know of couples who met that way and have been happily married 4 years since. So please, don't give up on holding out for a Catholic Match. It's worth a try if you haven't already, and if you have, I would say give it another try and see if God's providence will conspire to your benefit. Just download their app or head over to catholicmatch.com.